Hi there, and welcome to the first Prices at the Pumps for 2023. I'm Scott Squires, pleased as always to be joined by Dan McTeague. Dan, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Scott. Great to be here. And what a year ahead, and what a year we had.
Indeed, and hard to believe that it's been about a month since we last spoke and did a Prices at the Pumps. So I guess the first thing would be in the last month or so since we last spoke to do a Prices at the Pumps on the SaltWire Network, what are some big things that have happened or some maybe noteworthy moments that have taken place in the energy sector?
Well, Scott, we had a great Christmas and we had a great January New Year period in which prices were not just low, but went a lot lower than I think anyone had anticipated. And that's was really a welcome news for a lot of drivers here because, had you considered where we were in the 215, 220 range, back in June, all the way down to $1.38 to $1.42 was something that I think many of us were both surprised with, but no one was complaining. And same for diesel. We saw diesel climb down from its all-time highs in the 240, 260 range, all the way back down to where it is today, a much more comfortable $1.60, $1.70, in some places a lot cheaper. But behind all of this has been the constant drumming of negative news in the month of October, November, December. We saw concerns about destruction and demand destruction, COVID outbreaks in China, the US and other central banks around the world tackling inflation by increasing Freudian slip there, by increasing interest rates. And of course, the belief that this would create a significant slowdown in economic activity. Well, you and I spoke last. I said, watch out for the second week of January, because that's when things would get real. Sooner or later, years of divestment, this pushing down of these prices for artificial reasons, including, of course, the U.S. using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve for something that was never meant to be, price stability. We're now at a point where they're no longer using that. Interest rates may not be heading that much higher. According to many analysts, inflation numbers, therefore, are not as significant as they were a month ago, let alone 2 months ago. And for that reason, along with the opening of markets in China and reality that there is a significant limited supply of all of the fuels that we need, of course, the ongoing war in Russia, in Ukraine caused by Russia, all of these things mean that we're going to start to see oil and gasoline prices and diesel prices and home heating fuel accelerate over the next several weeks. Again, starting January 2nd, the second week of January, I should say. That meaning, of course, that we've seen oil, as an example, move up about $9 a barrel just since the beginning of this month.
If you look at our coverage area, mainly in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador, of course, the SaltWire Network available around the world via the internet and other means. But here in Nova Scotia last night, for example, the interrupter clause was put in play, an increase of about 6.5 cents a liter on gasoline. And I know other provinces, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland and Labrador, adjust their prices different days. But if you're looking at a kind of a 30,000 foot view of the region, where are you seeing prices headed the remainder of this week and into next?
Well, those other provinces that haven't moved will move, and they will move up by about 8 to 9 cents a liter. So Newfoundland can hold back as long as it wants with a very deficient system that they use that doesn't always reflect market values and fundamentals. But they're going to see a reality there of about an 8-cent increase for gasoline and for diesel. PEI will follow as well. New Brunswick, of course, which changed the days and the measures of time, will also see a similar increase. But because we've already had the sting here in the province of Nova Scotia, SaltWire's region, it would be pretty important to point out we could actually see another 2-cent increase come Friday. So for that reason, brace for impact. And it really doesn't matter at this point what it's going to go up by 1 or 2 or 3 cents, or if they have to use their extraordinary measures in Newfoundland, or they have to use the interrupter clauses in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. The reality is that the market is pointing upwards, and the upside momentum is going to continue to push very strong over the next several weeks and into months. We maybe get a bit of a lull in February, but I think we're looking now at resuming that trek back to $2 a liter for gasoline and $2.60 to $2.75 for diesel between now and the middle part of June. Now, of course, that's a very long, estimation, But what you saw in 2022 will occur again in 2023 with the added aggravation of the federal carbon tax, as we know, imposed on Nova Scotia. They wouldn't do it to Quebec. And of course, in Newfoundland, where they will finally have to pay the full effect of a 14 cent a liter plus HST carbon tax. So it's coming. And what the markets don't do in terms of reflecting years of divestment and an attack on the oil and gas sector to ensure that there is no more production of energy, the reality is that what the markets are going to have to eventually cough up, the federal government is only too willing to add to the burden and to the cost. And you're going to pay through it in ways we've not seen likely this summer.
You and I have talked before about the years that you've been dealing with the energy sector and all of the different resources that you have to come up with your numbers and where you think the prices are going up, down, et cetera. And I know that you do this price predicting as best you can right across the country, all provinces and territories. But you and I have talked before about the difference in this region with the public utility and review boards. Without going down too deep of a rabbit hole, Dan, maybe just quickly explain the difference between markets that don't have these utility boards setting the prices and areas where basically the price fluctuates almost daily based on what the markets are saying.
Well, pretty much across North America, you have prices that are quickly reflected, at least in wholesale prices to gas retailers. Whether they choose to pass on increases or decreases is up to them. But, they only have control over 7 or 8 cents a liter, the final 7 or 8 cents a liter on the price of gasoline, very similar to the regulated markets. The difference, however, with regulated markets is that they tend to have their own diagram, their own formula by which they come up with a number at the end of the week. And some of it sounds legitimate. Some of it sounds interesting. But at the end of the day, it defies what everyone else in the country knows. If you're in Vancouver or you're in Montreal or you're in Toronto or any other city across Canada that isn't regulated, you have a pretty good idea 48 hours before what the price is going to be. So you can choose to shop, hold off on buying or wait until the day itself to make your purchases. The reality, of course, unfortunately, for regulated markets, and it's for those who become very accustomed to it, the purpose for which they were created have long since expired. In the case of Nova Scotia, it was to protect a class of independent gas retailers in rural areas who, frankly, no longer exist. Now, regulation has been around for a while. It's been tested off and on since the 1930s. But the reality is that nobody has perfected the art of predicting gas prices until about 28 years ago when a guy named Dan McTeague invented it. Now, a lot of other people have followed. That's great. But you have to follow the methodologies. Anybody who wants to know how I do it, look at the Toronto Star article by going back to January of 2009, predicting pumping secrets from the gas man. Basically, the methodology is very well established, and it's basically taking market numbers, multiplying it by the value of the Canadian dollar in a given day, and then dividing it by the number of liters in a U.S. gallon, which is 3.78541. That's how you get predictability, and everyone in the rest of Canada enjoys it. Unfortunately, in the regulated markets, it's really up to a handful of bureaucrats that who make up their minds based on a Byzantine, bizarre, weird, wacky, out of proportion formula to come out with a number that at the end of the week is never quite accurate because it's impossible to predict what's in their minds or their secret formula. It shouldn't be secret. And in fact, the data that they use day in, day out from markets scan from Platts ought to be surrendered to the public each and every day. After all, you as taxpayers in the province of PEI, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and New Brunswick pay for it. They have an obligation to make this available to you each and every day. You can then benchmark the 7 days divided by 7, and Bob's your uncle. You'll know with taxes what the price will be at the end of 7 days. But there's an easier system, Scott. Just get rid of it altogether. Regulation is for a time and a place that is long since passed. And I think we understand the internet a lot better than we have in any time in the past. We have a lot of the tools that are at our disposal. We should be getting on with this and, as it were, providing ourselves and be armed with the information that we need so that we can make those anticipations every 2 or 3 days rather than waiting for the government to decide what the price should be, often at variance with market realities and often hurting consumers.
Something else, Dan, I know you referenced it when you were kind of giving your overview of the last several weeks, but geopolitical situations can really affect what happens with world markets. And then that trickles down to what we pay as consumers here on the ground, in my case here in Nova Scotia. Are you seeing any other potential geopolitical situations that could have an effect on the price of oil on the setting of a price of a barrel of oil by the Saudis, et cetera, outside the fact that we know the war going on in Ukraine and what Russia's doing there? Are you seeing any other red flags geopolitically right now?
Not geopolitically, but I think the evidence has become absolutely clear. Whether you're the Royal Bank of Canada, whether you are the International Energy Agency, which doesn't like fossil fuels and told us not to invest in it and to divest from it 2 years ago, foolishly, they recalled that, or whether you happen to be benchmarkers for OPEC, everyone is aware of the fact that the world's demand and appetite for oil and gas is increasing. Everyone is aware that the ability to supply it is limited, and that when you have big players, the top three, Canada, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia has no trouble getting its product to market. Venezuela, it's a basket case, very risky place to try to get your product to market, done with the lowest environmental standards possible. And then you have Canada with the third largest provable reserves, where you have a prime minister walking around saying we have to have a business case made for this, or that we should go open a couple of mines to create the kind of environmental disaster that goes often hand in hand with those external to Canada. You know that you have a problem, and that the fundamentals are simply screaming at us that there is a supply crunch and demand is increasing. It cannot be met by the status quo. It means that oil prices are going to have to give to the upside, and you and I are going to pay for it. Not, as I mentioned earlier, just because of the price of oil. Geopolitically, a lot of what's happening globally can be laid at the feet of the Canadian government. If Canada had built 2 pipelines and been able to get 2 million barrels of oil out to the world markets, we'd be dealing with a very different set of circumstances geopolitically. I don't say it's the only thing, but 2 million barrels put into the market every single day beyond the United States would have increased the value of the Canadian dollar, increased our purchasing power as Canadians by some 30%. Mark my words, a Canadian dollar that is no longer the petrodollar means that every commodity we consume is about 30% higher than it ought to be. And we'd also be able to stabilize global prices to a large extent, because we'd have a ready supply, not just, of course, of oil. And I'm not even referring here to liquid natural gas. We were leaders in terms of projects 10, 12 years ago. We're now laggards. And unfortunately, there's a huge cost to that. When Canadians, as I have done, go to our hospitals and see the kind of hallway medicine that we're seeing because there's a lack of funding, because provinces and governments are pointing us to who's funding, you have to ask yourself why the country has walked away from what could have been $200 to $300 billion of economic activity, which would have paid for those hospitals, our social programs, and then some. That's what Canadians have traded away by allowing woke politicians to create not only higher prices for Canadian, but destabilize the global world order.
And Dan, with this being our first prices at the pumps for 2023, I think it's important to revisit something we've talked about previously, and that is you were part of the government for a number of years. You've dealt in energy portfolios in the energy sector for a long time. Some would say that perhaps you have a vested interest in either the oil side or the consumer side. Here's this first chance for you in 2023 to kind of explain what it is you do and why it is you do it.
I'm a straight up guy. I fought for consumers, got them rebates when I was a member of parliament, understood this industry, attacked it when it was anti-competitive in the way that no MP had done. But I certainly wasn't one of those who believed that you should kill the industry. Why? Because it's part of the reason why Canadians share in a prosperity that is unique to the rest of the world. Why Canadians have energy production, a diversity of energy production, which is second to none and is also extraordinarily clean. And we should be able to offer those technologies and those energies to the rest of the world. So as for me, I'm 60 years of age, MP pension, worked in several other private sector ventures, Royal Bank, Toyota Canada, Toyota Lexus Canada. I look after myself, and I call a spade, and I don't need anyone to take anyone's side. I have no interest in the oil industry. They're not fans of mine, and they certainly don't like when I predict gas prices because it hurts them financially. It anticipates the price that they're going to have to ultimately pay. I cut them off at the pass. As for consumers, that's where I'm at. I want to help Canadians, but in the same process, also shine a light on the phonies and the fraudsters and the hoaxsters out there that are using climate to damage the Canadian economy and damage the aspiration of Canadians and really wreck a perfectly good nation that up to now has been a beacon of light and hope financially and socially for the rest of the world. Dan, it's always great to have you with us here on Prices at the Pumps on the SaltWire Network.
We appreciate your insights and your expertise, but you're not with us all the time. So when you are doing other things, where can people find you?
AffordableEnergy.ca. Look at my blogs. Usually grab big topics of the day, put them into a Canadian perspective. Often hold the government's feet to the fire and try to hold them to account. And of course, gas price predictions, gaswizard.ca, when I'm not trying to guess what bureaucrats are doing in Atlantic Canada.
Dan, great to see you for the first time in 2023. Let's do this again next week.
Looking forward to being here on SaltWire Network, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dan. Bye-bye.